So thanks, Richard. Thanks for the introduction, and delighted to be here today to contribute to this next session in the active travel series. So really, the purpose of my presentation today is really to give an overview of typical option development and assessment processes applied on active travel schemes funded by the NTA. So my presentation, as Richard said, should take about 40 minutes, and then we'll try and make time for plenty of Q&A at the end. So I'll touch briefly on myself and then give really the context and frameworks really that are in place for the options assessments and process for typical active travel schemes. I'll use some case studies then to highlight the kind of more practical approach and kind of real life approaches to how we actually achieve our objective in this particular phase of a project, which is ultimately to arrive upon a preferred option. So there's a couple of case studies there we'll talk about, and then we'll have some final thoughts and learnings really to hopefully to take away from the discussion. So a bit about myself. I won't repeat what Richard said, but really I suppose a lot of my project experience is relation to walking cycling schemes delivered on behalf of the NTA and local authorities. And really, I suppose I have a passion for that kind of side of work, and ready to explain why that's the case. Just to start off with a couple of images here between taken from my own kids cycle to school, and kind of see the comparison between the kind of level of infrastructure that's provided in the left and the right on the same route to school. So really, I feel, and it's probably the same as everybody who's on this call and has an interest in sustainable travel feels an obligation really to bridge the gap between what we have on the left there, which is basically a line of paint separating vulnerable road users from heavy traffic and taxis. And then obviously we have the utopian scenario whereby we've got a completely segregated and route through a park, which is St. Anne's Park for any locals. But obviously, I personally feel an obligation that we need to obviously improve the level of infrastructure that we have in place for our own kids. And while that might sound a bit noble and grandiose, really I've kind of selfish motives as well, because I don't want to be continuing to ferry them to and from GA matches, soccer matches in school on a daily basis over the next 15 years. So as the man says, on your bike yourself and away you go, but we need to have the infrastructure in place. And really, I suppose, kind of going back to over the last year, and I know it was covered in Claire and Connor's presentation a few weeks ago in great detail, and some of the fantastic work that the local authorities have done over the last year. We really probably might perversely look back on the last year from our own industry perspective and kind of think of the days when we were able to get these schemes in place and have them embedded in quite a quick manner. So obviously you have the fantastic coastal mobility route there on the right, implemented by DLR, and then probably the most optioneered scheme, transport scheme in Ireland, the Liffey cycle route. Obviously was sections were put in place, and really, we can enjoy that ourselves here. Personally, we're based on the Keys, and it's a great scheme, and hopefully it's implemented in a more permanent manner in the years to come. But obviously, that these schemes are implemented, I suppose, in response to the public health emergency, and obviously, really things are set to go back to normal in terms of how we actually get to the stage of implementation. And I suppose that's probably illustrated by some of the challenges that DCC are facing in implementing the next stage of the Strand Road cycle scheme, which is essentially an extension of the coastal mobility route. And we have a situation where residents themselves are producing options for consideration. So really, it kind of sets the tone really for what I really want to set out today as to what are the normal procedures that should be considered and implemented as part of an options development and assessment process for an active travel scheme. So the context really, it all cascades really down from the public spending code, the common appraisal framework, and then the NTA's own project approval guidelines kind of set out the various I suppose decision points, documents, etc., that need to be produced throughout the life cycle of a project, but specifically in phase 2, the options assessment process. So the public spending code kind of sets out that really, to justify any public expenditure, a business case and appraisal should be prepared, and that can be done in any structured way really, and it's including measures such as a multi-criteria analysis, which we'll talk about later, SWOT analysis, etc. But there needs to be a clear demonstration of appraisal and appraisal of options. The DTAS really takes its lead from the DTAS Common Appraisal Framework, or CAF, takes its lead from the Public Spending Code, and kind of sets out what that framework might be and how you might actually appraise transport schemes, including active travel schemes, to ensure that there's a consistency across the board. Possibly in the past, promoters of schemes were accused of applying assessment criteria which were more favourable or less balanced than they should have been. But really, the Common Appraisal Framework sets out a solid basis for providing that balanced approach to options assessment. And then to highlight, I suppose, the different appraisal thresholds in the CAF, and as a side, the project bands of the NTA project approval guidelines there on the right. Really, the key point is that over 20 million of a project cost really it requires a full cost benefit analysis. But as most active travel schemes will be in the range of less than 10 million generally, or certainly less than 20 million, I'll really focus on projects in that kind of range and what the typical assessment criteria would be, or procedures would be for those type of projects. So just to set it in the context of the NTA, typical NTA project's life cycle, obviously the whole of phase 2 is dedicated to developing of the initial concepts and selection of a preferred option or options before we move on to preliminary design and statutory processes, etc. So a key gateway decision is the decision really to move on and to accept that the preferred option is indeed that option, and it's suitable for us to progress to preliminary design level. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get to that point, and I'll go through that now. So phase 2's purpose, as taken from the project approval guidelines, really, as it says, to develop the project concept through the option selection, including an appraisal of alternatives and options, and ultimately a selection of a preferred option. To stress, I suppose, that there is a key hold point in typical Band 2 project, whereby the option selection report needs to be approved by the NTA before moving on into the following phases of a project. But really, that should be a kind of formal approval process, and really the engagement should have taken place in advance of that, and the selection report itself should be a documentation of the overall process. Another key consideration, I suppose, where certain schemes might consider compulsory purchase, obviously there needs to be a demonstration that a local authority has demonstrated that a whole range of options have to be considered before deciding upon a CPO requirement. So that's another key consideration and justification for a thorough and robust options development and assessment process. So just to set aside, obviously, what I've just discussed there, which is essentially the context and framework for the overall processes, I'll now touch on a more practical approach, or with project examples of how typically options are developed on active travel schemes. So I suppose just some crucial first steps really is from the inception of a project, or from the commencement of phase 2, certainly of a project, really, it's important to establish a multidisciplinary project team, with differing views and differing expertise, I suppose. Some might be controversial, some people mightn't engage necessarily as easily as you'd like, but it's important to give people the opportunity to engage and ultimately encourage them to engage. So all stakeholders and all viewpoints are considered from the get-go. And it also helps to promote, I suppose, scheme ownership, whether that be amongst local authority planners, architects, officials in parks, conservation, biodiversity. All these views are important, and they're important from the very start. And as I mentioned before, while there's formal approval points for the NTA, as per the PAG, really the early and continual involvement of the guys in the NTA is vital to the ultimate success, and kind of de-risks the whole process, whereby a scheme is developed up to the point where an options assessment report is produced, and that's the first time the guys in the NTA see these options, that's obviously fraught with risk, and the guys obviously have a wide and extensive knowledge of these schemes and expertise to bring to particular schemes. So tap into that knowledge and engage with them continually and early. So really, I suppose, having convened your project team, as the important thing to do is to, before, obviously, as engineers, we love to get into developing options and solutions. But really, it's kind of to put the brakes on to a certain extent and take the time to understand, I suppose, the constraints and opportunities, but also to define what the study area is clearly, to agree the scheme objectives, and they should consider the wide-ranging views of your project team. And then from that perspective, you can then start to develop the options on a solid footing, that you have your scheme objectives in place, and they'll be the yardstick with which you assess your scheme options. So I suppose just to stress that, in terms of the option development itself, there's no monopoly on good ideas. There's no particular discipline that should be seen to have a higher opinion on certain ideas or solutions. And it shouldn't be a case of who came up with the actual the best option or the preferred option. It should be a collaborative approach, and it should be scrutinized. Any options that are developed should be really scrutinized and subjected to internal, I suppose, debate and discussion amongst the project team. So just to kind of now to get into some case studies, I've got 3 case studies, slightly different one from the other, really. And the first one here is just to explain how the options assessment process was carried out, and it was the R132 connectivity project in Swords in County Dublin. And just to explain how we went from what you see here in the image, which is essentially a dual carriageway road. It's an old national primary route, the old Dublin Belfast road, and it's obviously, maybe traffic volumes are a bit lower on that particular day, but as you can see, there's a complete lack of pedestrian facilities and cycle facilities, and obviously by virtue of that fact, there's a complete lack of or absence of peds and cyclists as well. So how we went from or how we decided to go from this situation to something which is akin to this, which is more an urban street with activity and facilities provided for pedestrians and cyclists, much more compact junctions to replace the existing roundabouts, and then an enhanced public realm as well to go with that. So I'll take you through the steps, I suppose, of that particular project. And I suppose the project team on this particular instance was quite broad and involved a range of authorities and bodies, obviously Fingal County Council and NTA being the lead on the project, but obviously with the R132 and the various initiatives proposed in terms of transport for Swords, including Metrolink and Bus Connects. There was quite a large team and a range of views that had to be considered from the get-go, and that was also from the outset, including the development and agreement on a scheme objective, which, just to skim over here, for that particular scheme was I suppose the objective was to change the character and function of the R132 from what is essentially a primary distributor road to more of a high capacity urban street, which would deliver enhanced facilities for all road users, but I suppose crucially with particular benefits for sustainable modes of transport. So that is carried forward then, I suppose, is the most relevant criteria that we use in our options assessment. Then when once we've come through our option development, we then assess whether those options can achieve this scheme objective. So the options assessment process, and this is a typical approach really on all active travel schemes, and not just the R132, is typically to take a 2-stage approach where, following our initial option development, we'll have a whole range of options, and under the first stage of the options assessment, we would sift out a number of those options, which I suppose on reflection may not achieve the scheme objectives and may not be possible to practically deliver those schemes. What options then that actually pass on to stage 2 then are subject to a more detailed and rigorous multi-criteria assessment. Following that stage, then we identify what our preferred option, or maybe in some instances what our preferred options are. So just to give you a flavour for the options that were developed for the R132 scheme, and as you saw from the images, obviously the junctions along the route are large roundabouts, and so we considered a number of options where we sought to modify maybe the existing roundabouts or upgrade those roundabouts, and the images here obviously illustrate a cycle protected roundabout on the top left, and then we have, for example, here and the bottom right, a turbo roundabout with grade separated facilities for peds and cyclists. And I suppose generally in undertaking the first shift, we felt that, you know, the grade separation of pedestrians and cyclists was not something that really was aligned necessarily to the scheme objective, and we're providing for sustainable modes. We felt the provision was less direct than possibly at-grade solutions. So, you know, for that reason, for example, the first option there, the protected or upgraded roundabout, was included for further option development, was passed on to stage 2. It aligned with, I suppose, junction typology in the National Cycle Manual. The second option, the turbo roundabout, didn't align with National Cycle Manual or the draft Bus Connect's design guidance, and it also, as I mentioned before, it provides for less direct facilities for peds and cyclists. And for the same reason, you know, while I'd love to see one of these schemes implemented in Ireland, it's the same reason, you know, grade separated cycle and pedestrian bridges similar to these ones in the Hoven Ring here in Eindhoven, on the top of the screen, and then we have a circular pedestrian and cycle bridge in, I think it's in the Pudong district of Shanghai in China. So obviously, while Swords is to be an emerging city in the coming years, I don't think it's going to be as populous as this area in China, which kind of would justify such an intervention. But really, those options were sifted out and weren't carried forward, primarily for the reason that the facilities for peds and cyclists were less direct. And then we looked at further modifications to this, particularly was the Malahide Road roundabout, which we do have, I suppose, traditionally the main movement vehicular traffic would have been north-south along the old Dublin-Belfast road, but following developments and proposed future developments in the area east and west of the corridor, obviously the movements east and west became particularly important, and particularly for bus services. And so we looked at an option here where, you know, we modified the existing roundabout to create, you know, a throughobout or a hamburger type arrangement for bus pedestrians and cyclists as well. So that option was passed forward for further consideration because it actually delivered enhanced services for buses, pedestrians and cyclists. It didn't ultimately emerge as one of the preferred options, but it was passed into stage 2. And then we kind of go to a number of variations on a signalized junction, effectively where we take out the roundabout and replace it with different signalized junction arrangements. Here we have the example of the classic National Cycle Manual type arrangement, which is slightly dated at this stage based on types of junction typologies that have been implemented on new schemes, where, you know, we have basically the roundabout removed, we've at-grade pedestrian crossing facilities, and we have cycle lanes through and around the junction. But crucially, I suppose, those facilities are generally on lane through the junction. But that was passed forward to stage 2 because it essentially provides for those enhanced facilities for active modes, and also complies with the NCM and the Bus Connect's design guidance. Then kind of 2 other variants that were considered, and obviously the cycle protected signalized junction, which is a junction type which has been rolled out broadly as part of the Bus Connect's Bus Connect scheme across the city. It really, I suppose, it provides an advanced level of protection for cyclists at key conflict points of the junction, as distinct from the previous option, which has had basically cyclists traveling through the junction at grade and unprotected from particularly left turning movements of motorists. So that was considered to be passed forward, and while it's not in the NCM, obviously there's the NCM has been updated at present, and it is considered as part of the draft Bus Connect's design guidance. A slight variation on that particular protected intersection obviously is the Cyclops junction design, and while it's not currently proposed for anywhere in Dublin or Ireland at present, it's obviously quite an efficient type of design which seeks to to enable the movement of pedestrians and cyclists at the same time around the junction, and hence meaning it's a more efficient junction from a traffic movement perspective. But I suppose crucially, in this instance, it does require pedestrians to cross the cycle track at different locations, and I suppose there's potential for conflict there, and there's an issue that has to be resolved in relation to universal access, and particularly with visually impaired people. So again, a particular arrangement there which could work well beside, directly adjacent to one of the Metro Link stations here. The Seatown station is shown at present, where it would facilitate, the movement of peds and cyclists together, and I suppose more frequently across the junction and in multiple directions as well. So a good option. Again, not in the NCM, but it is included in the Bus Connects design guide, so taken forward to stage 2. So really, I suppose, just in terms of the options development, really, obviously, the consultant engineer shouldn't shirk his responsibilities and should be really, leading, I suppose, in terms of the option development. But it's important that, there are workshops held, and different parties are encouraged to contribute towards the option development process. And when we do have a full suite of options, and the initial sift is undertaken as well, really, that should be a collaborative approach as well. Maybe the consultant performs the first sift, but it's presents as the findings of that particular sifting procedure, and it's subject to scrutiny by the wider project team, and then there's a general agreement amongst the product team to proceed to stage 2. It's not advised to go through your sift and then on to stage 2 without taking time to take on board some feedback from the project team. And often that can be a quite quick process. It can be a single meeting or single workshop, and then there's a consensus, and then everybody's happy to move on. But really, it's imperative before you even begin any of this that the scheme objectives are in place. Otherwise, you've no means to actually sift those options out. So then you move on to stage 2, which is a more detailed process, which is obviously the multi-criteria analysis. And I suppose, to take the definition from the Common Appraisal Framework, really it's any structured approach to determine preferences among alternative options. So, you consider a wide range of criteria that could bring about, I suppose, differences between the options, and to enable you to compare those options together before you determine a preferred option. So really, I suppose the MCA is seen as obviously a much more quicker and cost-effective method of appraisal compared to a full cost-benefit analysis, and enables, I suppose, an identification of a preferred option or a number of preferred options in a quite efficient way. So the appraisal criteria should be qualitative and quantitative, and I suppose they should be based on the main criteria set out in the CAF, which are economy, safety, integration, environment, accessibility and social inclusion, and physical activity. So your sub-criteria then, which should be project specific, what should flow from those main criteria and should relate back to the scheme objectives. So it's key that all aspects of the scheme objectives are covered in those criteria, but you don't overcomplicate the process or double count particular aspects of the scheme. So another key consideration is whether the weighting is correct for certain criteria, and not to consider criteria that don't result in any difference between the options. For example, under environment, if you're to look at flora and fauna, across the board of a scheme, which is not going to have any impact on vegetation or trees, there's no sense in including that in your overall appraisal criteria. So key thing is to actually document, why, before you start the process, or before you formally document the process, really, is to set down what your actual criteria are and what metrics are being used to assess or compare those options. It usually takes a number of iterations of the MCA to get your criteria, to be happy with your criteria and to be happy with the metrics that you're applying. So really it can take a couple of passes, and really some feedback from the project team as well to really bottom out on what you think your assessment criteria should be, and ultimately what your preferred option is. There's obviously numerous examples now from various active travel schemes, which obviously the NTA would I suppose presume be happy to share with their local authorities as to what might be a reasonable criteria to apply to different types of schemes. But there is kind of general guidance provided in sections 4.2 and 4.3 of the CAF also as well, in terms of what criteria might typically be applied. So just to go through quickly some of the range of the criteria we looked at in the R132, obviously we took the main assessment criteria from CAF there on the left, and we kind of took sub criteria then stemming or flowing from those. So you can kind of see under economy there, obviously capital cost was one consideration, but obviously as well then we looked at, you know, under economy transport reliability and quality as well. So some people generally can approach economy in one direction, and that's related to cost, but it's important to look at other facets of the economic benefits that might accrue from particular options. You can see environment as well there. Quite, you know, you've got your standard environmental considerations, but obviously under 5C as well, we included a particular element related to urban design, because it was a key piece of the scheme objective, really, was to kind of change the character and environment of the R132 to a more of an urban street. And there are emerging proposals for the R132 when Metrolink comes along as well to alter the environment significantly. So that was a key consideration as to whether options could fit with those overarching kind of objectives. The ranking scale that's used, I know traditionally people have used different approaches, and you know, some people like to kind of use a numerical approach where you know, different options are ranked based on a numerical scale, and it kind of gives you a very absolute answer as to which is your preferred option, etc. But generally on active travel schemes, the NTA prefer to use color coded, a 5-point color coded scale, which is kind of shown there, which kind of ranges from those in the dark green as those enjoying significant advantages, down to those with red, which would be at a significant disadvantage compared to other options. So again, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of how the overall MCA process is kind of summarized under those multiple criteria for this particular R132 project. So we had our 4 options there, which passed the first stage, or the stage 1 SIFT, and we assessed those as against the existing scenario, which is important to do to relate it back to the existing. So basically, if you could just look quite simply under capital cost, just to explain it, you know, obviously the existing scenario, we're not proposing any interventions, would obviously rank higher there, because obviously there's no capital required, or capital cost required. And then, you know, as we move on through the options, obviously the ones which we propose to retain the roundabout and modify it would be, I suppose, ranking slightly higher than those which would require greater level investment, which is the removal of the roundabouts and replacement with the signalised junction. And so further on down, you know, you can look at the other aspects I talked about. For example, the universal access issue with the Cyclops type junction. You can see how that ranks slightly lower than the cycle protected intersection and the signalised intersection, which don't have those conflicts. So yeah, really, you know, you cascade down the overall sub criteria to identify what might be your overall ranking under the main criteria. Then is the next stage, and kind of in this particular example, obviously option C, which was the protected intersection, emerged as our preferred option. And quite crucially, that point I made about the universal access issue, which was considered under accessibility and social inclusion in this instance, was quite telling, and really was marginal in terms of the difference between the protected intersection and the Cyclops junction in this particular instance. So yeah, that was our preferred option, and you know, that was taken forward then, and generally the same procedure is applied on the other junctions along the scheme. And you know, essentially the scheme itself, obviously, then all that was documented in an options report and presented to the public for feedback, and that was then fed back into our preferred option, which has been submitted to An Bord Pleanála at this stage, and we're hopeful of planning approval on that in the coming months. So yeah, just on that particular, there's some points there to take away. Really, you know, it's important to hold that workshop to discuss the findings of the initial assessment, and really to give people the opportunity to interrogate and question those results. You know, that feedback then should be fed back into the final options assessment, which will be used to determine, I suppose, or formalise what the emerging preferred option is to be presented to the public. Another second case study relates to a scheme which Dublin City Council has developed in the northern fringe area of the county, which is or of the city, sorry, which is close to the border with Fingal County Council, and really it's a slightly different scheme in that it's a scheme that was partially constructed and wasn't completed just prior to the recession in the noughties, and really it's just an example of how, you know, while a particular scheme might be in place, and the direct conclusion you might make is that we just complete the scheme as built. You know, when you feed it back through a multi-criteria assessment, you consider, you know, emerging policies in the intervening period, and how they might influence a particular options assessment process. So the scheme is Balmain Main Street, which is basically in around the North Fringe area, as I said, and the scheme ultimately will connect to the Malahide Road and form part of the Clongriffin Corbus corridor connecting to Clongriffin Dart Station. But essentially, you can kind of see there in the dash green lines a section of the uncompleted link, which is to be completed as part of the scheme, and then the as constructed section there in the purple image. So really, I suppose just to give you an image of the road or as is, and you know, well, there's no line markings present at the time of that photo. Obviously, the road's in place, was built up to base course level, and you know, you'd imagine that the answer is to finish out to complete the missing link based on the same cross section, which basically allowed for 2 lanes in either direction. It was always identified that one of the lanes would be a bus lane, but crucially, no facilities for cyclists. So really, I suppose when we started the scheme, I suppose there was an emerging master plan, which we were obviously made aware from consultation with the planners in Dublin City Council for the Bell Lane and Bellcamp area, and there's a obviously objective to deliver 2 new town centres, essentially east and west of the Malahide Road, and you know, the main street itself would provide a strategic artery connecting those townlands, whether it be Bellcamp, Darndale on the west, and then Bellmain town centre on the east. And there's a number of amenities such as parks, schools, etc. as well, which would require to be connected via the main street and across the Malahide Road. So part of that master plan, the key objective of that master plan was to provide a strategic ped and cycle link, crucially, to enable people to, as I say, to access these amenities by using the active travel mode. So that was a key consideration in setting our scheme objectives and our assessment criteria. So we looked at 3 options essentially, which was the do minimum, where we just stick with what we have basically, and we don't provide any facilities for cyclists. The second option was to provide for a 2-way cycle facility on one side of the road, and obviously that will require a lot more land take and a lot more cost to go with it, because you know the whole street would generally have to be reconstructed, and then a modification of that, which or a variant on that, which is basically a cycle track on either side, you know, parking protected cycle tracks on either side along the entire length of the scheme. So really just to touch briefly on the assessment criteria, appraisal criteria that we use there. Obviously capital cost, as I mentioned before, and economy, option 3, requiring the greatest land take and greatest level of intervention or modification, what's there would obviously rank lower. But there's another point to note, you know, under accessibility and social inclusion, generally you look at deprived geographic areas, and as the kind of North Fringe area is noted as one of, I suppose, a socially disadvantaged area, and the key element of the Bellmain Bellcamp master plan was to provide for an active travel link for that population to access amenities and education, etc. You know, that was applied and given probably a greater weight in terms of the other 5 main criteria. So it was an important aspect that we needed to consider, and the options were ranked accordingly. And option 3 emerged as our preferred option. While, as I said before, it obviously ranked lowest in terms of economy and capital cost, it in all other elements, it ranked as high as others, or if not higher, particularly under safety. Obviously, we felt that the provision of cycle facilities on both sides of the street was a better solution, and that was developed in consultation with obviously DCC and obviously the NTA, Oliver Michael, and then the Bus Connects team. So the preferred scheme, which we're hoping will go to construction quite soon, will probably ultimately be the first section of the Corbus corridors, which will be a new section of the Corbus corridors, which will be built. And you know, you can see there it's quite a radically different cross section to what we were presented with at the start of the project, and will include, for public realm enhancements, parking, cycle tracks, footpaths on either side. So we're hopeful that it'll provide a good basis for the redevelopment of that area. So final project example is really, I suppose, a slightly different approach, and where time allows or permits. We on the scheme, particularly to use the example here, is a Wellington Lane pedestrian cycle scheme in Temple Oak, South Dublin County Council and the NCA kind of led the scheme with ourselves, and the decision was taken to really to look at, I suppose, an earlier form of public consultation to inform the option development process, to, I suppose, promote ownership of the scheme, and obviously to glean whatever feedback and ideas the public would have. We undertook a number of workshops with businesses, with elected representatives and schools, and then we held like a public forum, which was a really good event where we basically convened a number of different people of differing views and had them sit around a table and work through the issues themselves, and it gave them an appreciation of the challenges that we were facing as a project team in arriving at a solution that kept everyone happy. And we're hopeful that we'll come through this and this process, and South Dublin will be commended for. They have been commended for the level of engagement on the scheme. You can kind of see from the image there, you can see Finola and Jennifer McGrath from South Dublin County Council trying to explain our position on things and trying to resolve some of the issues. But it was really useful because you had people, as I say, of different ages, different viewpoints, who sat down at the start of the process, or start of the evening, probably at loggerheads, and by the end of it, they were coming up with solutions collectively together. And so that was a really good process. And another really good initiative that we did was really kind of workshops with the different schools along the route as well. We asked the kids to give us their feedback, and like with kids, the information you get back is unfiltered, honest, and really great feedback that you can then use to take back to to possibly allay or diffuse some of the issues that disgruntled adults might have. So we got various things that suggested to us, obviously, in terms of protecting the cycle lanes with curbs, providing for public realm and planting, etc., along the route, even seating and kind of biodiversity initiatives as well, which is great. And then the next stage, which we're at of this particular project, is actually to trial particular measures along the route, and to let that inform the options assessment process. So, generally we kind of tackled the link sections between a number of roundabouts along the scheme, and tried to address particular safety issues. The roundabouts themselves, which are probably typical of roundabouts in the southwest Dublin area, obviously have a number of issues, as you can kind of see from the cyclists here, trying to use the existing facility that's been given to them, which is effectively a piece of paint, and what that does, it brings them into conflict with obviously panel vans and cars, which are dominating the existing environment. So really that was a means, I suppose, to take some urgent action. I suppose that particular junction itself, which is the Templeville roundabout, obviously there was a fatality suffered there a few years ago as well by cyclists. So really South Dublin took the decision to implement trial measures at the junction, which included for pedestrian crossings where they were non-existent before, and protecting the existing cycle lanes, and to then to invite feedback from the public on those particular measures, and then bring that back into the overall options assessment process, and let that be a factor in determining what our preferred solutions might be on a permanent scheme. So we're at the stage now where we're actually at the end of our trial, which has kind of been a 6-month trial of those measures, and we're reviewing information from feedback surveys provided on the SDCC console portal. We're obviously have our own observations and review of site conditions, traffic surveys have been taken, and also intercept surveys were undertaken at key junctions as well. And some of the information that's coming back there is not only useful for our project, but obviously would be useful for the NTA as well going forward when they look to implement these type of interventions. And they can determine what the particular views of different road users were. So really, just to come to a close on my presentation, and like while it's important that the options assessment process is thorough and it's documented as such, and there's a lot of technical documentation produced and drawings produced, etc. Really having agreed amongst the project team as to what the preferred option is, have that documented, but send the communication piece and how you get the preferred option and the benefits associated with that out to the public in a manner that can be understood. And that's increasingly important. Like the lowly engineers, technical drawings and reports are of less importance these days. And really we live in the generation where people want to just consume their news and by 140 characters of a tweet or a quick snappy video. It's important to display that in a manner that people can understand, as I said, the benefits of the scheme and the advantages of it over other options that were considered. So just by way of an example, this is a quick snip of how we've tried to summarize a 500-page options report for a scheme which is out to consultation at the minute on the Royal Canal in Fingal County Council. We've tried to summarize the benefits of particular options in a one-pager where people can hopefully grasp in plain English why we see things in a certain way. So then just, I suppose, Michael Ahern was keen for me to kind of just touch on this and really as to what the kind of standard timing of when you might go public on through the options assessment process. So really on a standard NTA active travel scheme, the recommendation is that you would go out to the public following determination of your emerging preferred option, and you would issue at that stage a draft options assessment report. You take on board and any feedback as part of that consultation process, and then bring that back into the determination of your preferred option. You might consider at that stage then a second round of consultation based on that preferred option as well, which is what we've done on the Royal Canal scheme there, which I just showed you. So just final thoughts from my end of things. Really, the options development and assessment process, it has to be robust. It obviously has to withstand public scrutiny, and it must demonstrate that the solutions we've come up with are appropriate. And it might be the first solution you considered, but you need to demonstrate that you've considered a whole range of options. Collaboration is key, as I mentioned earlier, and that's not only towards the end of the process, but throughout, whether it's setting your scheme objectives, scrutinizing the option development and the options assessment as well. Tap in, I suppose, to the knowledge base of your project team, and the holistic approach really to these schemes is no longer really, I suppose, the exception, but rather the expectation, and that's even borne through in certainly the pop-up infrastructure that's been rolled out in the last year or so as well. So engage with the NTA team throughout, and not just when the formal approval is required, and that will obviously de-risk the whole process as well. If the guys are continually engaged, obviously there's less potential for change throughout. And then possibly, if time permits, maybe earlier forms of public engagement, trialing of measures could be added to your option development assessment process. And failing that, obviously we have an increasing evidence base now, particularly following the implementation of infrastructure in the last year or so, which you can kind of rely on as well. So that's me.